I was sitting downstairs working on my computer, and I was feeling this oppressive feeling of not really wanting, doing what I wanted to be doing, not really like being in the world in the way that I want to be in the world. And, the like disheartening quality of like not really being sure of like what to do to change, the reality of that that feeling. The feeling is like this feeling of so many years have having gone by, and feeling like not much has changed in my life in the way that I wanted it to, and I don't feel as competent in all the ways that I wish I did. And I feel kind of like boxed in, and I'm not really like sure what I want out of life going forward. Feels like the road before me is kind of straight and narrow, and it's sort of like when you're younger, you kind of hope, you kind of you see the potential a lot in life. You see the opportunities of where you might be and what things may turn out like in the future. So you have your dreams to look forward to. And it's a little bit difficult sometimes to come to the realization that what is possible in life. There's a lot of things that that are possible, but there's only so much that we can do and focus on, and what we can achieve, we can only achieve it by making difficult choices a lot of the times. And there's a lot of opportunity costs involved. And so in order to survive, we make choices, choices that eliminate other choices. And it's not just in order to survive, it's like in order to to do what we where we perceive our survival is at stake, or where we feel threat inside of us. And when we're younger, we're not necessarily trained to be able to handle those threats, those feelings of threats, and be able to like countermand a perceived threat to a real threat. And so we may make choices that limit our options in life, and we make these choices over and over and over again, millions of times, until we're sort of forced to look at the reality of our choices. and the reality of where our choices lead us. And we realize perhaps that, a lot of what we've done for safety and comfort is also stifled us in a lot of ways, and we've made decisions about ourselves and about human beings and what other human beings expect from us, and we try to we try to make the best decisions that we can in order to be accepted, in order to get by and to get along, especially with those that are close to us in our lives. But a lot of times, we try so hard to mitigate disasters, perceived or real, that it can kind of take the magic out of life at a certain point, when you feel like all you've become is this cage for the real self, whatever part of the real self that still remains inside of us. Our personality has become this cage, the cage that was constructed in order to keep us safe. But instead of what we've achieved by building this cage, we may have achieved a certain level of safety, but it's also a cage, and we didn't realize that's what we were building when we were making our snap judgments in the times where we took sort of emotional photographs of, okay, this is like an overwhelming experience that I don't ever want to have again, and now I'm going to construct my personality in a way that is going to mitigate future occurrences like this, future traumatic occurrences. And so to some extent we may eliminate some of the negative possibilities, but we also what we don't see is the hidden cost of all the possibilities that we eliminate, that are associated with that part of our expression, that part of our feeling of freedom to express ourselves and to go into those directions. That those directions don't always lead to the same disasters under all circumstances and conditions, but because we've sort of been set by trauma and our fear, that's the only thing that we can see when we want to move in those directions. And so it becomes a very visceral response inside of us when we want to, when we get a little bit older and we realize, hey, I've built a cage for myself. I don't want to live in this cage. I want to be expressive. I want to feel powerful in this world. I want to feel seen. I want to feel impactful. I want to feel creative. I want to feel like I'm doing something, like I'm not just consuming other people's creations. And yeah, it's frightening. It's frightening to be sort of your own you're sort of living with, like there's the people in our lives that have traumatized us, but now we've become our own sort of oppressor in a way. Like we are the ones, when we become adults, we become the ones who have to sort of be the parent that keeps us safe, because they're sort of like the emotional body, which is like the inner child. And then there is like the impressions on that emotional body. And then there's the thinking, sort of intellectual part of us that's sort of like the parent. And the parent sort of tries to like explain things to the child from its best understanding. And the child is very trusting of the parent. But like every parent and like every child eventually begins to understand is that the parent is not as infallible as it once believed in its naive childhood. And so it's sort of like we grow up twice, or at least maybe I have. Because first, we grow up in the sense when we're young and we believe sort of everything that our parents tell us. And then as we get older, perhaps, I don't know, like in our midlife, we begin to realize not everything that our own mind tells us is true, and that our own mind is sort of modeled after a lot of the experiences that we had as children. And so our whole system of logic and valuations, might be detrimental, to the health of our emotional inner child. And it becomes like this oppressive warden that makes us second guess ourselves at every turn, and it makes us into these comfort seeking people who live very unsatisfying, quote unquote, safe lives. But internally, like that life sort of wants to move, and it doesn't just want to sit around and watch the world go by and feel sort of irrelevant. But like an overbearing parent might try to do, stifle a child to keep it safe. Our own minds can become like overbearing parents trying to keep the child safe from having experiences that are distressing. And so I was just like feeling like a lot of feelings well up in me as I was sort of feeling my working on the computer and feeling myself sort of going into somnambulism and just sort of unconscious entertainment absorption. And it just felt like my inner child was telling me like, hey, I don't like this. I don't like sitting here. I don't like what you're doing. I'm bored. I'm not satisfied. I can't tell you what I want, but I don't want this. And, so, I figured coming up here and talking to the camera, allowing sort of like that energy to flow, so give my sort of emotional body, my inner child, some voice to speak, to have that energy flow, so that I don't feel quite so trapped inside of that mental prison of, habits and thought patterns. And yeah, I definitely feel a lot better having said this, having spoken this. And yeah, I'm just grateful that I'm grateful that I have a voice and that I'm able to speak. And I think I have like some like fundamental instincts that, help me be courageous in ways that I think are, probably going to be what ends up improving my life. And yeah, it's something, there's something in me that has always been able to, and there's an adventurous part of me that I seem to be able to override, like the mental part of my, my being, my brain, the mental part of my physiology, and sometimes put myself in situations where I'm very uncertain, of what the outcome will be. But sometimes, that's where life is the most satisfying, when you're like in the flow of doing something that you've never done before, and you're constantly, your brain is, sort of like it's hungry, it needs food, it wants, and the emotional body is sort of like hungry for experiences, novel experiences, but novel is, it's sort of relative to the person who's experiencing it, because what is novel to one person is, something very well tread and well understood by somebody else. So, novel just means new to the individual experiencing it. Yeah, and I think it's easy to like get trapped as we get older into like the routines of our lives in order to maintain a certain homeostasis and equilibrium. But then we also need to sort of like challenge ourselves to create, to sometimes like stir up, the environment, and make changes and try new things to, keep things fresh, in the internal organs of our emotional sort of sensory experience. Otherwise, it's just like, you just feel like you're going to sleep, and you feel like you're like, and then you feel like you begin to lose touch with your own identity, and you kind of like begin to feel like you're like this amorphous, sort of hard to define being that is just sort of like witnessing life as life goes by, and it's all motivated by fear of, pain and suffering, and fear of the unknown. Yeah, so feeling feeling a little bit better having said this. You guys have a good one.